Welcome to the Never Been Promoted podcast and YouTube channel. I'm on a mission to help you cut the tie to all the things that are holding you back so you can unleash your entrepreneur. Hey, welcome. We are live all day today with a bunch of cool entrepreneurs talking about AI. We're talking about today podcasting next with Noah Tetzner. He is the founder of, I believe, Profit with Podcasting. So, I had show notes and I've closed them. I can't find them. So I'm going to just go off memory now. It's that time of day where you just wing it. It's going to be great. Hey, if this is your first time here and you haven't seen this before, thanks for coming by. If you've been here before, you've seen a few today. Thank you. And if you're listening on the podcast, I appreciate you tuning in. Our mission's clear. We're trying to help 1 million entrepreneurs get better in entrepreneurship. We need more entrepreneurs in the world. I think it's super important, specifically for the United States. I think it's a great competitive advantage, and I want to do my part to help them get better at it because entrepreneurship is hard. You tend to hold on to things in the past. That's why we have the cut tie. It's the idea and the metaphor of cutting the tie to all the shit that's holding you back. We want to get rid of that. We want to get rid of the excuses, the fears, you got to navigate people in your life that are maybe pulling you back, or you just maybe in some sense of entitlement that you might come up with. All that stuff is no good for the entrepreneur. You got to move forward and with a clear mind and do it well. Take a moment if you can, if you don't mind, to subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's my kind of only call to action. If you're listening to the podcast only, give it a good review. Just take a moment to do that. It means a lot for the community and for the mission we have to do that. But enough shameless promotion. Let's drop Noah in here. Noah, how are you doing today?
Hey, Thomas. I am great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I like the podcast background. I'd hope you'd have a full podcast mic and you weren't like rocking a phone, being that you're a podcast consultant and I'd have questions of your brand authority if you did it that way.
Fair enough. Well, I'm glad I didn't disappoint too much.
No, you're in. Before we kind of get going a little bit here, I'm going to throw it out there here for you. Let's start with this.
Yeah.
Icebreaker question. What is your favorite podcasting platform?
My favorite podcasting platform. Ooh, this is going to get a little controversial, but I'm an Apple Podcasts guy. Always have been. Always have been, always will be. I'm really excited about all the new integrations that they're coming up with. I loved the when they recently, probably about, 6 months to a year ago, made it so that you can, instead of using a platform like Patreon, you can subscribe, have a paid subscription to your favorite podcast on their platform. Really excited about what they're doing with transcriptions of shows. So it's got to be Apple Podcasts, Thomas.
I mean, I'm a Android guy myself, but most of our downloads come from Apple as well. So I'll support that. I mean, I'm not picky. And you got to go. Just because I don't use Apple doesn't mean other people shouldn't. So it's good. I agree. Profit with podcasting. Obviously we do it for our business. We leverage it as, there's a bigger play for community that, more legacy stuff, maybe tied to my personal ideas, but just stuff that I don't want to specifically in the long term be the lead of. I just want to have started and the idea of never been promoted. And it ties to our business to some degree because we meet a lot of people we can help with their business growth. Back up, just maybe give me the one-liner on your company today and back up to kind of how you got there of your, how you got to becoming the consultant that you are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my company's Profit with Podcasting. My motto is you show up to record, we handle everything else, and we help entrepreneurs connect with their ideal prospects or partners and grow a massive audience. I got into podcasting as a hobby back in 2018. and I started a show about Vikings of all things. I'm a huge history buff, and I knew that I wanted to start a podcast about something. So it might as well be history. And to be honest, Thomas, Vikings were just hot at the time. Like the TV show Vikings was on the History Channel, and I was an avid viewer. So I decided to start a podcast about Vikings. Got the equipment actually from my father. That was his Christmas gift to me. And my first guest was the professor of medieval literature at Oxford University. And didn't really know what I was doing, was just passionate about history, asking these experts that I cold emailed. That's how I got them on the show. They had written books, and so I tracked down their emails, asked them questions that I was genuinely curious about. And within 5 months of launching the show, the podcast was doing 50,000 downloads a month. And subsequently from that, I got invited to travel to Europe on an all expenses paid trip to cover an event in York in the UK. I wrote a book and got a book deal during COVID, tens of thousands of dollars in sponsorships. And it was kind of like in that moment that I realized, wow, there is a lot of opportunity here in podcasting. So that's how I got into it. And then from there, I started helping other people. I got my first kind of jobs out of high school were in marketing agencies as basically an account executive, worked my way up the chain of command to director of client services at one agency. And all the while I was doing my own podcast and helping clients on the side. And I was really learning the business side of it all. And I think, Thomas, the real value in podcasting, as I'm sure you've experienced yourself, lies in the relationships that you can build. I always say that even if I didn't get one download from any of the podcasts I've hosted through the years, I would still be doing all those shows because I've met lifelong friends, clients, referral partners, strategic partners, just because of the magic of relationship building that having these conversations, with people allows you to create. So in kind of a nutshell, that's how I got to where I am now.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's interesting because we've always done podcasts and YouTube for business, and it's a very small percentage of what people listen to podcasts for. And I've always said I would love to do a non-video podcast because it's so much easier to produce.
Right,
I mean,
right.
like it's like a whole different world if you just say, hey, listen, I just got to do audio and put it out, and use Buzzsprout or something else just to publish it.
Yeah,
So talk to me through that. So like, because when you're doing a podcast, right? I was very intentional that the one I do is related to a triangle of business, right? So one's related to Instantly Relevant, my agency, my growth agency. The other is obviously to the community of Cut the Tie, which is entrepreneurs, and then the book and stuff that's coming with that. And because if it doesn't, typically they don't work, right? They just kind of fall dead, and
right,
people don't listen to them. So you're using it as a way to meet people and you grow a channel. But
right.
the Vikings one's interesting because you just did it as a passion project for fun,
I did.
and it worked
Yeah,
out. So and luck or not, you pick something topical. I mean, I'm like season 4. I think Ragnar just died in the Vikings, so I'm still in the middle of all that.
I love it.
Um, I watched Game of Thrones like with my wife like 20 years after it came out. I think it was like we were so late. So when
Yeah,
I quote Game of Thrones now, people are like, "What?" I'm like, "Never mind." But tell me how important it is. So let's go down the path. Like,
yeah.
did you have a monetization plan? You just wanted to do it. You talk to me about how that kind of went down from and I'm selfishly asking because I mean I would do a weekly podcast on something if it made money. I sure but how do you do that? And so take me as a
Yeah.
dumb customer that would like to do it.
Yeah, I mean, when I first got into podcasting, obviously it was just a hobby for me and it was following a passion. So I didn't have any well-developed plan. But as I started doing the show, things quickly unfolded. So, a sponsorship is what everybody instantly thinks about. You mentioned monetizing a podcast, and everybody's mind instantly goes to sponsorship. And that's one way. I mean, you know, just for example, because the Vikings are so niche, right? It's kind of random. Like Vikings of all things, how can you monetize a podcast around that? But just to give listeners a sense of the types of companies I've worked with as sponsors, we've done quite a few deals with basically armories, people that like actually make medieval weaponry and sell some sort of hand forged sword for like $1,200. We also did a deal with it was like a $10,000 deal that we did with a competitor to like 23andMe. basically an ancestry company, that you basically, send them your saliva in a tube, and they tell you where your descendants were from and so forth. So that's really interesting, right? That's a company that deals with history and heritage, and that's what the podcast I produce is about. We've also done some things totally unrelated to the topic. Like we've had several VPN companies sponsor the podcast, just because they're looking for people who are on the internet. People that are listening to the show are definitely on the internet. So that's one way to monetize a podcast. And just to give listeners a sense of how to do that, what I would say is find companies whose product or service directly aligns with your ideal client avatar, right? So for me, that DNA company was a perfect match. And then what you're going to want to do is find out who the relevant decision makers are at that company. And for sponsorship, it's going to be typically somebody in a marketing role. And I would recommend going to the top of the food chain in terms of marketing titles, VP of marketing, chief marketing officer, something like that. And then use an email sourcing platform like Apollo.io or RocketReach.co and find out who the chief marketing officer at that company is. Pull them up on LinkedIn and then drop their name into one of those platforms, and they should give you their email address. So it's really that simple, and then basically you email them with a proposal.
I mean, and extend that. Depends on what your podcast is, and we target marketing people specifically, but invite them on the show.
Exactly.
So you're in the model you're describing, I'd call it the Joe Rogan model, right? You're trying to get, but there's a step you mentioned before that. So there's different, I'd love, because I'll talk about how we monetize our podcast and what we do with it, but because it's completely different. We don't have a sponsor, but we still made, tens of thousands this year in our first year, and we get maybe 200 downloads a month sometimes. Like, right. It's like, it's just starting, but yet how did you do? So I'll explain that, but you started with a huge downloads. So you still have to start with something that works. You still have to start with, and your timing was good because more people did podcasts during COVID and they started listening. But I think start with that. How did you get that thing off the ground? Did you advertise? Did you just put it out there and holy shit, people downloaded it? Talk about like the first few, because that's the part people miss. Like, you have to stick with it. So talk to me about the early days, because to get someone's attention, the first thing they ask is how many downloads do you have?
That's right. Yeah. So what I did, I would say first and foremost, just actionable advice for listeners. Your content has to be unique and it has to be really freaking good. So everybody thinks history is boring, right? So what I did is, instead of these kind of narrative, long-winded history podcasts, that's a lot of what was out there at the time. I was one of the first history podcasts, to bring in guests. So every episode was myself and an engaging guest. The professor of medieval literature at Oxford University, a historian from the University of Iceland. And I would talk about things that I thought listeners would legitimately be interested in hearing about, like Viking death poetry or great last stands in battles of the Viking Age, and just really engaging things as it related to my specific niche. So the content has to be really good. And then basically what I did is I found a way to syndicate my podcast with other publications. You might even call them content mills. So, organically, when I launched my podcast, I think, the first few weeks of hosting the show, there were maybe 30 people a week tuning in. But I developed relationships with a couple different websites. One of them was a medieval history blog that had over 300,000 followers on social media. One of them was actually a history encyclopedia website that had a couple million followers on social media. And I developed relationships with the CEOs of these companies. And I said, hey, look, your website's always looking for content. Feel free to take our podcast and turn it into blog articles or publish it on your website. And I'll make you a sponsor at the beginning of each episode. It's free content for you. And, anybody that consumes my content is being directed back to you through the sponsorship anyways. And the downloads just went up and up and up from there. So that's how I grew to 50,000 downloads in 5 months, for these kind of syndication content partnerships.
And so I think that's a great point. So you did some work. You had some good content that probably became better. You look back, you're like, oh, I can't believe we did that. And so that's okay. So I would tell entrepreneurs or people thinking of doing podcasts, don't let sucking stop you. because you're always going to suck relative to where you're going later. Like, so you're always going to start off rougher, and it doesn't matter as much as the relationships you went and said, and you had a strategy behind it. So, so if you're looking at, let's say, the Never Been Promoted channel, and it's all about entrepreneurs, what comes to mind? Who should I be reaching out to do that exact same things? We don't do that right now. We focus more on YouTube and LinkedIn and some other things. And our intent has never been to do massive downloads, though that'd be great. But I hear you, and I'm like, oh, that's a really good idea. I never done that. So what comes to mind? Who would an entrepreneurial podcast like ours even go to? Like, who should I be reaching out to?
Yeah, that's a good question, Thomas. I mean, instantly what comes to my mind are like trade publications or associations for you, right? I mean, organizations like EO, which has done a lot of work in podcasting for their various chapters throughout the country in the U.S. Other sort of like middle market associations, or maybe even get industry specific. People in real estate might be a good industry for you, or small business associations. You know, places and publications that are fostering community, and they're looking to create content for their members. And I would go to the directors and the content coordinators and so forth, probably marketing titles primarily of those places. I'd build a relationship with them, and then I would pursue a content partnership with them.
I like that. And it's like, here I'm in Atlanta. It's like, let's go hit the SBAs locally and just rotate people in and put some of their people on there. And I look at that, it's like, cool. If, the SBA of Alpharetta, where I live, or whatever it is, or of some kind of county goes, hey, send me some of your people that pay you to be, members. I'll put them on the show.
Yeah.
You're saying, I go, listen, I'd like to thank the SBA of whatever, Fulton County, for their, support. You guys just go put our stuff on your website. And that's the trade. It's like, hey, you just talk, we'll promote what you're doing and saying thank you, and you go push our stuff out into your website and your channels. That's how you do it.
Absolutely. And another great
Brilliant.
way to grow. Yeah, and another great way to grow is through just promo swaps, which I do constantly with people. I mean, it's as simple as finding a like-minded podcast in your space. Doesn't even have to be the biggest show. And developing a relationship with the host and saying, hey, would you record a 1-minute plug directing your listeners to my podcast? Hey, if you've enjoyed the show, go check out the Never Been Promoted podcast, which is about X, and I'll do the same for you, and we can both grow together. So my experience is most podcasters are extremely collaborative, and everybody wants to grow their audience. So that'd be a good strategy as well.
Do you ever recommend, and this is a little riskier, guest podcast hosting? Hey, you're not meeting with me today. So I've always avoided it because I have a brand. I'm the guy on here doing that. But have you gone down the guest? It'd have to be someone like special, like, oh shit, that guy is doing it today. But like,
right.
Talk to me about that if you've done it, or maybe you don't recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, I try to stay away from it because it's all about relationship building in podcasting, as you know. But I've seen it done. I've seen it done before. It typically works well for really large organizations that have kind of a rotating cast of hosts, and people that use podcasting for like account-based marketing to basically bring in ideal prospects and partners as guests. If you have a sales team, it's not a bad idea at all to have several members of your sales team take turns hosting the podcast, depending on who the guest is.
That's good. I like that too. Like, so you get people involved that can handle it. A little riskier. So I'll talk about our model, by the way. So when
I'd love to learn.
So this is interesting. So it's a complete, and there's like Podfest, right? That's in Atlanta. I want to go present this in like a workshop because it's a different model. So we started our podcast January 1, and I signed up for times. Hey, I'll do a podcast a week. All right. We shoot 5 to 15 paid sponsored shows alone, not including others, a week. We had to go to live because we couldn't keep up with production just to get it out there. But here's what we did. Because I had value to add on a marketing agency, so we can create all the socials and all the stuff, and I have a good network on LinkedIn, we said, hey, listen, if you self-sponsor your show, we'll promote it across multiple channels and we'll buy advertising. Now, and so what I did is, since 90% of the people sponsor the show, we put all that money back in. This is how we grew to 1 million subscribers on YouTube in like 30 days. We did a very focused campaign, and we grew based on the sponsored money that people have put in, which pulls more people over to it. And it's a reverse model where you're like, I have other value to add if you want to get behind this community, what we're doing. Yeah. And it's made money, but we don't take it as revenue. We just invested it back in. And the idea is, if you have something of value you can add to somebody, you can ask them to sponsor and you can prioritize those shows because they're getting involved in your community way that they support what your mission is. Ours is for entrepreneurs. So we go to entrepreneurs and say, hey, listen, you're in it. We want to bring you in. You're going to get invited into Cut the Tie community and all this other stuff. And we've grown really, really fast that way. Now, you just said a very important thing that I haven't even thought about is let's actually go for the actual podcast downloads as opposed to focusing on the video YouTube. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go reach out to the Atlanta SBAs tomorrow. And I'm like, hey, listen, I have this podcast, Entrepreneurial. I'd love to do a content exchange where we'll feature people and, and I'll, for you guys doing that, I'll get them on a call and talk to somebody like that. And I think that's a brilliant idea because I'll be able to measure that very quickly to say, oh, wow, we got an uptick, of an extra 50 downloads this month by doing 2 or 3 of those or just them mentioning it. So, and I think people listening to this or watching, you're seeing the value Noah could bring to you from thinking through stuff, right? So I assume when you work with a customer, I don't know if you have an opinion on their podcast. Do you ever go, this is a terrible idea for a podcast and here's why? Or do you help them just make the best of it?
No, I totally do. I mean, there's some ideas that just do not work in podcasting. You know what I mean?
Well, give me an example. Give me an example of one that would not be obvious. Like you might be like, people think this works and it never does, and why?
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of bigger organizations are turning to narrative style podcasting, which I enjoy listening to. Kind of like an NPR kind of journalist type thing, but it's really hard to monetize that as a business because there's no exchange of conversation. You know what I mean? So a lot of people,
but also a business that should not be their goal as sponsor. It should be to be meeting people. I think there's a different completely, especially as a corporate piece. I don't know. I have my opinion on that. Like if you're a corporation and not an individual, unless your corporation is like a for good, like there's a bigger play that's not like money. Anyway, I agree with you. A narrative piece. How many episodes can you do on what exactly that drive attention?
Right. That's exactly.
You run out of content. I mean, so this company, his name's Automation Anywhere. They automate. They're a robotic process automation software. They had a podcast. And I'm like, how many times can you have the conversations about how to automate process and keep it interesting? And I sometimes even on this entrepreneurial podcast, this one, I'm like, how many times can I have conversations around entrepreneurship to keep it interesting? And it's like, you just got to bring on people who do different shit. So I get it. How important is it niching? So, and I always like to use autobiography a little bit because I'm one who, this is why we have the shows. I learn from people like you, and I actually go take action and implement things. So we're very focused on entrepreneurs, incredibly broad. It's not niche enough. My organization that kind of funds a lot of this stuff is a lot around verifying other marketing agencies' ability to deliver. So we're like taking our podcast and shifting it to be much more around marketing, around growth. Because I think if you're too broad, entrepreneurship is too broad.
Yeah.
And I think the more narrow you get it, though, you're kind of pucker up like, well, am I limiting? No, it's got to be tied. So for us, it's tied to the people we want to meet for our business. Right. How often, I mean, first of all, what's your opinion on that? And how often do you see people make that mistake right away?
Oh, it's super important to be niche. You know what I mean? And fundamentally, in an ideal world, whatever the name of your podcast is, if you're thinking about launching a podcast and having guests and building relationships, the name of your podcast should be something that ego boosts your guest, right? So like I'm in Nashville, Tennessee right now, and I'm actually in the process of launching a local Nashville-based podcast where I interview business leaders in Nashville. And I'm still working out a name, but whatever it is, it has to be something that if I invite someone on the show, they go, yes, that's me. So like, the Nashville Business Leader podcast. It doesn't have to be fancy or Music City Moguls or something like that, like
I was on Nathan Lotka's Top Entrepreneurial podcast. Like that's a great example. It's got like millions of downloads. Exactly. It's funny. I named this thing Never Been Promoted. First of all, the URL was available, so that was important. But and Unleash Your Entrepreneur was not available. I was like, I wanted to name it Unleash Your Entrepreneur because it's kind of like that be in the name.
I like that.
But then it's like, I have another brand called Sexy Voice Guy, and I'm like, what do I do with that? So do I just got a bunch of other dudes that have really good voices and bring them on, and you just target?
Right.
And you get voiceover actors that basically sound really good and like Like, okay, let's hear it. Like, what's, and so like, the point is, I get what you mean. Like, I want to go on that because I have a sexy voice. I want to go on that because I've never been promoted.
So I just have to ask Thomas, like, are you the sexy voice guy? Is that one of your talents, is voiceover work?
Oh, yes. If you Google sexy voice guy, that's actually me. That's true. All shot in
Dude,
silhouette just to protect my brand and identity. Truth.
that's awesome. I don't know if
Yeah.
you're a UFC fan, but I actually recently hired. You can do it on like Cameo. Bruce Buffer, who's the ring announcer for the UFC.
Yeah, he's Michael Buffer's brother, which is just, I'm sure
Exactly.
he hates to hear that, but he is the UFC guy that kind of sounds like his brother, but is not his brother.
But is not his brother. So I wanted like it's time. I wanted him to do that for my podcast. So I went on Cameo, I think it is, and pay him to do that. But I'm gonna have to get you in on that, Thomas, because I think we can.
I should go to Cameo and be. So okay, so let's take
Yeah.
a pivot. So never been promoted. This is my action plan. And listen, and you may think I don't ever want to pay people for coaching, so I just bring them on, or even better, I get them to pay to come on. You're
Love
smart.
it, man.
But I'm going to go do this. I'm going to take, we already set the idea that we're going to be a little more marketing focused for Never Been Promoted, which means we got to update our kind of descriptions and stuff. But I also got to wait for those shows to start coming out before I do that, because there's a bunch coming out that aren't around marketing, which would confuse them. Anyway.
Yeah.
So we have that. And then I'm going to go do some local, relationship building with SP. I think that's a beautiful idea. It's easy to do from a local standpoint. I probably can hit 15, 20 people in a day and see what I can get out of it, and figure out the exchanges. So I'm going to take that action. Now, let's pivot. Let's go to Net New Podcast. It's always been an experimental channel. We have like 38,000 people on TikTok under Sexy Voice Guy. It's been all over the map, from me telling like, our story begins in the deep, dark, or like crazy kind of funny frogging stories, to like AI inappropriate. Anyway, the point is it's got a range.
Yeah.
That's the brand. I own sexyvoiceguy.com. I have the socials. I want to actually use it for my own personal social, but I would love to do a podcast. Where do I take it?
So let me ask you, who of your clients, like who would be a client? Somebody who's looking for voiceover work?
The whole idea is this would be your style, where I want downloads. And I want a true pure podcast, no video. I want downloads, and it doesn't matter. I'd say it doesn't matter the content, as long as it matters a little. I don't want anything too inappropriate. But the point is, how do you take that name, and you said it's got to make somebody say, I want to be on that show. So do I just go find voiceover actors that have sexy voices and we go have conversations? I mean, and what is that conversation about? My point is, what do you do with a brand like that? If I was a client, what would you do with it?
Well, I think for the Sexy Voice Guy brand, it almost has to be this like memeable brand. You know what I mean? Like, for example, the show Hot Wings, right? Like, you get a bunch of celebrities, they're getting interviewed, they're being asked all these deep questions, and they have to eat a hot chicken wing. And, there's a certain spectrum of how spicy the wings are. And by the time they're on like the 10th wing and they're sweating and they can't breathe because the wing's so hot, they're being asked these like existential deep questions about their life. You want to do something unique like that. You have to like build this like fun experience around the Sexy Voice Guy, whatever that looks like, whether it's bringing celebrities on your show, you only ask them questions in a sexy voice, about a certain topic. It could be like life advice and life coaching from the Sexy Voice Guy. It depends what you want to do with it. There's tons of like sleep podcasts, like the Sleep With Me podcast, where it's people. There's one, gosh, I can't remember what it's called, but it's a podcast you listen to help you go to sleep. And all it is a guy reading like the most boring Wikipedia articles. That's literally what it is, about science and just everything. And it helps you fall asleep. So you could look at that as well.
Here's the problem. I would do that. I'd be like, let's say you're doing like instructions how to build the Millennium Falcon Legos. Actually, there's no words in that. So but the point is, I'd be like, did you hear that? He said, screw, that's screwing deep. But my point is, don't over tighten it. Oh, that would wake you up. And so anyway, the point is, I wouldn't be able to hold the boring.
To hold the boring thing. Yeah.
I would. All right. I like the idea. Like drunk history. You get people drunk, they talk about history.
Right.
But I think for sustainability, right? How do you do a solo show then?
That's a good.
Do you read? Do you just say, I'm going to read parts of 50 Shades of Grey today?
You could. You could. You have to create some sort of useful content that people want. You know what I mean? I mean, people love audiobooks. People love consuming content. So that
Yeah, I'd
could
be
be.
interested. So, hey, listen, I have no permission to do this, but I'm going to read 50 Shades of Grey in a podcast today. And it's going to be chapter 1, chapter 2. And that's like one. And you add some humor in with
Exactly.
it. There you go.
Exactly. And I mean, there's plenty of books that are in the public domain. You know what I mean?
I mean,
They're
can you
called,
do that? Can I read a book out loud and monetize it for the point of I just read this book. I just read books.
if the copyright expired or it's in the public domain, you absolutely could. You know, like I think, for example, Tom Sawyer or any of those classics, Tale of Two Cities, Pride and Prejudice, that's all in the public domain.
I don't know if that'd be public domain. So, all right. So it's a brainstorming. I'm going to put it on you. We're going to take this offline. But the point
Love
being
it.
is with you is that you have to think through it. And what I'm getting to is, I'm putting you on the spot, but regardless of what your brand is or what you're doing,
Yeah.
you got to tie it to something that's sustainable. So a big part of podcasts, I think a lot of people quit is they have a good idea, but they don't think, and they don't think, how do I sustain the content? And that's where like guests come in. And a big part with, like, I know we're trying to do solo shows is I don't know what the hell to talk about over and over every week. So that's why I bring guests on, because they're different. They have perspectives. They're adding value to the world.
Yeah.
If you can't solve that, if you can't figure out what maybe it's topical, like you're just like, hey, I take news feeds and and it's a political one. That's an easy one, right? There's whatever, but you still have to come up with a perspective. Just reading out news isn't going to do it. You have to come up with whatever it is.
Right.
If you can't sustain the content, I'd say don't do it. And maybe you would disagree with that, but if you can't figure out a way to endlessly get content, don't even start.
You're right. You're right. And people asked me that when I started my Vikings podcast, like, hey, is there enough to talk about? And absolutely. I mean, I've done, almost 100 episodes of that show and still going, just because there's so many little nuances that you can dive into. And there's nothing wrong with talking about the same topic in from several different perspectives. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Nothing wrong with that at all. So I totally agree. You have to have enough content.
So one of the ideas that I was looking at from Never Been Promoted, and I don't know if this is the right format, but is bringing on two people with completely opposing points of view. And an extreme would be like, I think Republicans are better for entrepreneurship. I think liberals are, whatever.
Yeah.
And you come and this is one of my skill sets, and what I is the moderation and inserting humor, letting it get to, is to bring on people with different perspectives on a topic of entrepreneurship, and we debate it. And it might not be all your content, but when you have people, but the idea of an engagement, when you have two polarizing views, brings in both audiences into your thing. So have you done any of those types of shows or been on where like you're the other side of like, this guy's insane, there's no way this is right, and you have to debate it? So that was another format that we were looking at of how can we create a more debate style podcast where it's a healthy debate on entrepreneurship or marketing or sales or whatever. What's your take on those types of formats?
I love them. I think they work, and they work because they're engaging. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You're right. You have two people with different perspectives. And I think it'd be fun. I mean, politics obviously is what everybody thinks about when they talk about debate, but I think it'd be fun to do something marketing related too, or business related.
Yep.
Two different perspectives on something. Like, AI can be kind of controversial to some people. So a debate about AI would be fascinating.
I mean, and there's a lot you could do, and I think it's the whole thing doesn't have to be like that. You could just have those shows. Hey, this is a debate show. Those are good live ones too, because you get people into it. But and I think we're going to take Never Been Promoted down that path of, hey, let's find. And I'm one who's like, man, I don't really like to get into politics, but the truth is, if you want to grab some attention, like, we're going to debate which political candidates can help entrepreneurs better, and the two perspectives. And the best part is, as the host, I can moderate and not have to take a position on
it. Totally.
So I don't have to get hurt by it. I just feel like, well, that sounds crazy, or that, okay, well, that, I don't think that's right either. The point is, because that's who I am. I don't want either one of them. Anybody. But I don't mind talking about it to get people all riled up. It's kind of instigator.
Yeah. I like that.
Listen, this part of the show too. I listen. Who do you want to get a hold of you? And so I can quickly create a banner for you. Where should they go?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the best place to get a hold of me is profitwithpodcasting.com. pretty simple. And I would say, if you're a business owner who has ever thought about launching a show, now is the time to do it. I can honestly say that every good thing I have in my life, almost every good thing I have in my life, I can trace back to podcasting in some way. The business I've built, the clients I engage with, all of my referral partners, even lifelong friends. You know what I mean? I mean, I was just in Europe for 2 weeks on a cruise that I didn't even have to pay for because I got it through my podcast. You know what I mean? I was there as media, promoting the cruise line through my podcast. So that's just an example of like what can
Yeah.
happen. Also, if you're looking to be a guest on other podcasts, that's one of the things I specialize in as well. It's part of the way I grew my own podcast to 50K downloads a month, is I guested on over 30 different shows in a 4-month period. And that's great because growing a podcast audience takes time. But if you can speak to large audiences that already exist of your ideal prospects or partners, that's an excellent way to grow your business and at least get your feet wet in the podcasting
Yeah,
realm.
no doubt. And I did that. I did that as well from but not for the podcast, but for the business. And I'll
Yeah.
tell you, it helps to time it. So I know I have a book coming out this year, and then I'm going full on to reaching out to podcasts. Hey, I'd love to come on and talk about what we're doing. Never been promoted in this book, because then it kind of ties a few things together,
Yeah.
and in your personal profile. And I'd have an intention reason to do it. And if it's just to build your podcast, that's fine. But I'd say if you have, hey, you got a book coming out, what's it about? Like, those are good ways to go build stuff, to go become guests. And especially if you're, you've already kind of have a brand going. So I agree with you 100% on that. If there was a question today I should have asked you and I didn't, what would that question have been?
Man, we covered a lot of good stuff, Thomas. I guess one thing I would just say as well is I talked a lot about growing a podcast and how to get more downloads, talked about sponsorship, but I would also talk about podcasting for business growth, right? So like I did a show called Profit with Podcasting, same name as my business. And that show, I did it for about 12 episodes. And the show never did more than 200 downloads a month. 200 downloads a month. But I've made 6 figures just through that podcast. Basically what I did is I interviewed 12 people. All of them were perfect candidates of people to work with me. And of those 12 people I interviewed, 3 I converted into clients. One of them, the client ended up, pays us every year, over $50,000 through our services, and that's kind of a strategic referral partnership agreement. It's a white label deal. But like I say that because I invited somebody on the show as a guest. We developed a great relationship, built amazing rapport in the 1 hour we had together. And then there was just kind of this emotional high after the interview. And it's like, oh my gosh, that was so fun. How can we do more of this? How can we work together? We started exploring different ways that we could both make money together and we could both serve one another's clients. So you don't have to have a massive audience to be successful in podcasting at all. And if you're thinking about doing a show, I would just highly recommend you do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll tell you, like, you're just describing a very similar model. Like I said, we're doing Never Been Promoted. It's, we don't do a ton of downloads, but we haven't focused on the downloads. We focus on the relationships we're doing in introductions. And I use it as a way often to meet and get to know you, so I can refer people to you for business. So
Yeah.
we use it very much so. Hey, if I can spend an hour with them, asking them some hard questions, see how their humor is, how their demeanor is, do they have a personality? I'm much more comfortable to say, hey, listen, if you want to get on some podcasts, go talk to Noah. You want to start one? Go talk to him. Perfect. And that relationship type of building is where we focus. Like, I want to meet people and get to know them. And if I can meet them and get an hour of their time, and they get an hour of my time, there's a different connection level than just even a 15-minute or an email. So that's an interesting way to do it. Now, if you can mix everything, downloads, sponsorships, plus that other pieces, then you're on your way to to not needing to be promoted. Say it that way.
Yep. I love it. Totally.
Hey, I'm all about metaphors, people. Hey guys, all right, listen, conscious of time here. I want to make sure you guys know how to get a hold of Noah. What you need to do is you got to go to profitwithpodcasting.com. So if you're listening to this, that's profitwithpodcasting.com. It's actually a pretty cool site, very colorful. I like it. And just check it out if you have any. I mean, it's a great place to start, right? I would think anybody who's just, hey, I'm in it now. I don't know what to go do. I'd like to start, but I don't know where to, we're a business. We're thinking of doing it, marketing. Come talk to you about it. I get it, and I think it's a good first step, or a good way to say, hey, strategically, we'd like to pivot to something else. It's good. Noah, thank you. I'm going to put you in the periwinkle room. I'll be right back with you, but I really appreciate you coming on today.
Right on. Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you, Noah. Guys, profitwithpodcasting.com. Check it out. Noah's super knowledgeable in this space. He's one of those guys that kind of got it and figured it out and then did something with it and extended it and then built from it. And there's people who make it because of luck, and there's people who make it because they know what they're doing, and then they take advantage of every opportunity that's come along and they do something more with it. And that's Noah. So check it out. Profitwithpodcasting.com. If this was your first time here and you've made it this far, you rock. I hope you come back. Hope you check out the YouTube channel and subscribe at youtube.com/neverbeenpromoted. And if you'd like, join our community. There's some cool stuff coming. Go to neverbeenpromoted.com and check it out. If you're listening to this, take a few moments, please. Apple, Spotify, do the 5-star review. It's super important for the community and for our guests to get more exposure. And it really helps us kind of, move the mission forward to create more entrepreneurs. But until we meet again, get out there and just go unleash your entrepreneur. Thanks for listening.